Hey guys, welcome back to Magyar Arcade, and today I'm making yet another Final Fantasy tier list. I know there's already a couple on here, but I still wanted to do it. Who knows, maybe I'll bring something new to the fold. For this list, we're only covering the mainline games, so no sequels or spin-offs. We're also not including the vanilla release of Final Fantasy XIV, since even Square pretty much likes to pretend that never happened. Without further ado, let's get to tearing it up. Alright, first off, we have the original Final Fantasy. Released in 1987 in Japan and 3 years later here in the States, it can only be described as a surprise success. Planned to be the swan song for the struggling developer known as Square, they developed a fantasy role-playing game similar to Dungeons & Dragons, originally under the title Fighting Fantasy, but since it would be their last game, they ultimately decided on the title Final Fantasy. What they didn't count on is the game selling 500,000 copies and spawning one of the greatest franchises in gaming. You play as 4 nameless warriors of light tasked with retrieving the 4 crystals and bringing peace to the world. Playable classes include warrior, monk, thief, as well as the black, white, and red mages. This game was so groundbreaking back in the day, but the series has evolved and come a long way since then. So, Final Fantasy 1, gonna put it in B tier. Next up we have Final Fantasy 2. Released in 1988, it didn't get a Western release until 2003 as part of the Final Fantasy Origins collection for the original PlayStation. Regarded as the weakest game in the entire franchise due to the game mechanics being severely broken, you can literally get stronger by beating up your fellow party members or instantly beating certain bosses by maxing out the teleport spell. Replacing the standard leveling up with the APB system, which basically means the only attacks and spells you use are the only ones that get stronger. However, for all its shortcomings, it did offer some new elements to the series. It introduced the Chocobo, which would go on to be the official mascot of the series, the first game to use magic points for spells, a character named Sid, which is a reoccurring theme, the front and back row formation mechanic, as well as the first game to feature a cast of playable characters with backstories in the form of Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon. We're joined by various cast party members that sadly die one after the other. Rest in peace, Minwu. Emperor Matthias is a great villain, but sadly isn't enough to save things. Final Fantasy II, this one's going in D tier. Next up is Final Fantasy III. Released in 1990, this is another one that didn't get a Western release for a long time. Not until a remake came out for the DS in 2006, and not until 2021 in the form of the Pixel Remake Collection based on the original game. Anyways, Final Fantasy III was somewhat of an apology for its predecessor falling flat on its face. Back were a new batch of nameless warriors of light dubbed Onion Knights, with a bigger number of character classes that you could now switch on the fly, because some of these you're only going to use for one boss fight. Yeah, I'm talking to you, Scholar. It's also the first in the series to feature summons, which is pretty cool, and it brought back the classic leveling up mechanic that was missing in 2. The story's pretty bare bones like the original, but it's still a step up. Final Fantasy III, gonna put it in B tier right in front of 1. Next up is Final Fantasy IV. Released in 1991, it was later released that year in the West as Final Fantasy II for the Super Nintendo. The first of the 16-bit era and the first truly great entry in the franchise. It follows the tale of Cecil and his quest for redemption after being deceived by the King of Baron, who we later find out was killed by the Fiend of Water and masquerades as an imposter. As well as offering one of the best love stories in the series between Rosa and Cecil, even throwing in jealous admirer Kain, who's hands down the best Dragoon ever, to make an interesting love triangle. There's also a bunch of guest party members like in 2, only this time, none of them die. In terms of first, it introduced the active time battle system, a series staple that would last for the next 5 games, and though the character classes were unchangeable, it made things a lot more stable. Final Fantasy IV? Gonna put it in A tier. Next up is Final Fantasy V. Released in 1992, this is the third and final game to not get a Western release until much later. 1999 to be precise, as part of the Final Fantasy Anthology collection for the original PlayStation. It tells the tale of Bartz and his companions who discover that the 4 crystals of the world are losing their power and ultimately serve as a seal for the evil sorcerer Exdeath. Worst name ever. You got a long-lost sisters side story going on with Lena and Ferris, which honestly I wasn't invested in, but the game really shines in its return of the switchable job system, where if you grind long enough, you can unlock every ability there is. It's also the first appearance of Gilgamesh, who in this game is featured as sort of a joke villain who later turns good. as well as the first game to feature the death of a main party member in the form of Old Man Golf, who sacrifices himself and is later replaced by his granddaughter later in the game. Final Fantasy V, another great entry. Gotta put it in A tier right behind 4. Next up is Final Fantasy VI, released in 1994 and originally titled Final Fantasy III in the West. It's a big debate on which is the GOAT of the series, this or 7. I'm telling you right now, 6 is the GOAT. It's aged a hell of a lot better graphically, has the darkest story in the series, and the best villain. Yeah, that's another solid argument, is who is the best main antagonist, Kefka or Sephiroth? It's Kefka. You know why? Because he wins. At least for a while, by succeeding in causing the cataclysm of the planet, as well as becoming a god. Ultimately, he's defeated, but by then, the damage is already done. Some would argue he's the main character of the story and not Terra, due to the fact that he mass manipulates everybody like puppets throughout the majority of the game. Speaking of main characters, it has the largest cast with a whopping 14 playable characters, including everybody's favorite train suplexing monk, Sabin. It's also a big turning point for the franchise, shifting towards more of the steampunk sci-fi theme. Final Fantasy VI, it goes right at the top of S tier. Next we have Final Fantasy VII. This game really needs no introduction. For most people, it was their first Final Fantasy game. It brought the series into the mainstream, being the first worldwide released game in the series. It's the game synonymous with the original PlayStation and won a shit ton of Game of the Year awards. Not to mention it's the only game in the series so far to get a full-on remake at this point. And while 6 started to shift away from the classic fantasy template, 7 went full-on sci-fi with a futuristic dystopian theme. You're introduced to iconic characters like Cloud, Aerith, Tifa, and of course Sephiroth, the series' most famous villain. And while he's more of a complex character than Kefka, he doesn't quite succeed in his ultimate goal. But not before being responsible for the most tragic and heartbreaking scene in the history of gaming. Y'all know what I'm talking about. Not to mention One-Winged Angel is one of the greatest songs in games. The only thing that hurts Final Fantasy VII is graphically. The early PlayStation 3D graphics have aged terribly, but other than that, it's still a masterpiece. Final Fantasy VII, it goes right into S tier right behind 6. Next up we have Final Fantasy VIII. Released in 1999 for the PlayStation, this game remains quite possibly the most polarizing in the franchise. I personally have a love-hate relationship with it. Squall is hands down my favorite main protagonist in a Final Fantasy game, probably due to the fact that he looks most like me, except for maybe Bart's in 5. The love story between him and Rinoa and the fact that their respective parents never ended up together quite possibly remains the best in the series. The story is so good, but I'm not a fan of a lot of the gameplay mechanics like the GF and draw systems. One highlight in particular is the card minigame Triple Triad, which is a blast to play, but one thing that really hurts the game overall is the broken leveling up mechanics where grinding results in more powerful enemies. Feels counterproductive to me. Ultimacia is right up there with the series' greatest main villains, but she's sadly overshadowed by Cypher, who serves as the secondary villain for most of the game. Final Fantasy VIII, despite being rough around the edges, is still a great game. I'm going to put it in A tier between 4 and 5. Next up is Final Fantasy IX, released in 2000 and the final chapter in the PlayStation trilogy. This was really a return to form for the series, featuring a more classic fantasy theme and forgoing all the awkward game mechanics from the previous entry. This one arguably has pound for pound the best cast of characters, with Sidane being up there with Cloud as one of the series' best main protagonists. And is such a great character who starts off as a petty thief before finding out that along with the antagonist Kyuja are genomes created to merge the two planets together. New mechanics involve the active time events and the Mognet. It was also the last game in the series to feature the active time battle system for a while, and was also the last game in the series to be composed solely by Nobu Uematsu. Not much else I can say about Final Fantasy IX other than it's one of the best in the series. It's going in S tier right behind 6 and 7. Next up is Final Fantasy X, released in 2001 and the first game in the series to be released on the PlayStation 2. This was my first Final Fantasy game and my personal favorite. It's also the first one to feature voice acting and features the conditional turn-based battle mechanic, as well as the sphere grid progression system. The story has a big Star Wars-like vibe going on with it, with main character Tidus getting dragged into a foreign world and finding out that his father Jecht has become a destructive deity named Sin, with Jecht's fellow guardian Auron tasked with guiding his son on his quest. The love story between Tidus and Yuna is right up there with 4 and 8 as one of the best in the series. Speaking of Yuna, she's got to be one of the strongest heroines in Final Fantasy history due to the fact that we later find out that the Summoner's Pilgrimage is basically a suicide mission. And the fact that she's willing to go through with it tells you all you need to know. Not really a fan of the whole Blitzball minigame that you're forced to play at least one time in the main story, but that's really my only complaint about 10. It's also the first game to get a sequel in the form of 10-2. In terms of the main antagonist, technically it's Jack Broska's final Aeon, if you will. Technically isn't a villain, and the final battle against Yu Yevon is kind of a joke, so I think a lot of us can agree that the real villain in this one is Seymour. Final Fantasy X, my favorite game in the series, and an absolute classic. It goes in S tier right in front of 9. Next we have Final Fantasy XI, released for the PC in Japan in 2002, and a year later in the States, with the console version being released in 2004. This is the first of the series' 2 MMO entries. Seeing the success of EverQuest, Square quickly realized the potential of an online Final Fantasy game. You get to create your own avatar from one of 5 races: Hume, Gaika, Mithra, Elven, and Taru, and choose a class with its own strengths and weaknesses, where you team up with other real-life players to take on quests, dungeons, etc. While it wouldn't be as successful as, say, World of Warcraft, it still sold fairly well. However, the game has not aged well. 20 years later, the game's literally unplayable due to its difficulty arc and bare-bones interface. Final Fantasy XI, sadly, it's going in C tier. Next up is Final Fantasy XII. Released in 2006 and the last game to be featured for the PlayStation 2. Was the very first single-player entry to feature real-time combat in the form of the Gambit system. The story isn't exactly the best, with it being described as Star Wars meets Aladdin, and main protagonist Vaughn ends up taking a back seat for the rest of the more interesting cast. Not sure what else to say, except it's another great game despite being rough around the edges. Final Fantasy XII, I'm going to put it in A tier at the end. Next we have Final Fantasy XIII. Released in 2009, it was the first game to get a cross-platform launch on both the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, as well as the first to get 2 direct sequels. You play as the total badass Lightning and cast of colorful characters as you fight against fate to save Cocoon, trying to fulfill each other's focus to avoid turning into l'Cie. The ATB system that was missing since 9 makes a return, along with the debut of the Paradigm mechanic, for party members to swap combat roles on the go. Snow and Sarah don't exactly have a great love story, as it's a bit too sappy in my opinion, and the only way you can get Gil is selling your trash loot, so the game economy just doesn't work in my opinion. The soundtrack, however, is excellent, with Masashi Hamatsu, the co-producer for Final Fantasy X, returning. But that's about it for highlights, as 13 is easily one of the weakest entries in the franchise. Gotta put it in D tier just in front of 2. Up next we have Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. The second of the 2 MMO entries in the franchise, and holy cow was it an improvement over an 11. The combat is fast-paced and intense, a larger community of players meant you had an easier time finding parties, and you could actually get to the max level on your own if you wanted to. I only played for a couple months, but good god was it a blast! Not much else I can say other than it's a great game. I'm gonna put it in A tier right in the middle. And finally we have Final Fantasy XV. Released in 2016 for the PlayStation 4, I know a lot of people were upset with this one, and the gameplay feels almost like a total departure from the series, going full-on action RPG in the style of Devil May Cry. Not to mention the story is kind of weak, and you feel like you're in a Hot Topic J-pop boy band spending half the time cruising around in a car, only to face one of the worst main antagonists in the form of Arden. However, visually, it's beautiful, and riding a chocobo in an open-world map without zone restrictions is so satisfying. Final Fantasy XV, it's alright. Gonna put it in B tier behind 3 and 1. Well guys, that's my Final Fantasy tier list. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and feel free to comment your own tier list. Until next time, this is Tim from Magyar Arcade, signing off.